This is McLeod Insights, where we feature conversations with longtime transportation industry veterans who are now team members at McLeod Software. Our goal is to support and empower our customers by helping them learn about proven ideas and best practices that will have a positive impact on how they run their companies. Let's dive in.
Hello everyone, my name is Barry Brookins. I'm the Director of Data Science here at McLeod Software.
And my name is Criss Wilson. I'm the Product Owner for Business Analytics. And we're going to talk about some of the positive trends in trucking today.
So Criss, let's take a look at what drives the Class 8 trucking activity, and really one of the main things for really any class of trucks, no matter what kind of trailer you're pulling, are construction trends. So what do you see as some positives in construction that's happening now in the country?
Absolutely, Barry. Well, first, the news talks about residential and the lack of demand for residential homes. And interest rates are scaring people, sure. Right? It's a mindset more than anything else. It requires an adjustment when you're trying to buy your first home. And people were really excited about low interest rate. That allowed them to buy a house they really couldn't afford. And so we're having to go through that change. But one of the key things that you see is the way and the nature in the residential housing market, how things have changed. They call it rural, retiring, and resort. It's a trend. And you can see on the chart that 49% of the houses sold now are in rural areas. People, it's the opposite trend that we saw with the flight to suburbia during the days of NAFTA, when all the manufacturing shut down in the small towns and people didn't have a reason to stay in small towns, and so they moved to the large towns and the suburbs around the major cities. But you look at this trend and it's exactly the opposite. And so that's going to put a stress on small towns, and I'm living in one. I see it. The infrastructure's got to change. It's got to evolve to serve the people that are moving to those areas, whether it's roads or power or water and sewer. Those things matter. You can't really live in an area until you've got those things already there to serve you. And so that's actually a trend that I think in the future is going to drive a little bit of construction, and we'll get into that a little deeper here. Some of the key highlights we see, Barry, at just 26%, the share of first-time buyers was the lowest since NAR began tracking it, 26%. The typical first-time buyer was 36 years old. That's an all-time high. So people now, with the change in interest rates, are waiting longer to buy that first home. Mm-hmm. Typically, they're saving up more capital because they can't afford to finance. They have to make a down payment of substantial amount. They can't afford to finance the whole thing. The median distance between the home that was recent buyers purchased and the new home from which they moved is 50 miles. And that's a reflection of that rural resort,
moving out,
retiring.
Yeah.
They're moving out. Yep.
Yeah, I think maybe some of the being able to work remote and all for some people, that's had an effect too. That and decentralization of offices. I don't have to live next to where I work, or even in the same city, or even in the same region of the country.
And we're a perfect example of that, right, Barry?
Sure.
You live in Alabama, I live in Texas. We work together every day.
Yeah, that's right.
So
yeah, and you think of the other things that spawn from a new home. There's got to be carpet for it. There's appliances. There's curtains. There's paint. All those activity that one new house generates in the market. So.
You don't need as many square feet when you're retiring. You've got an empty nest, but you want the nice things, and so you can afford those, typically speaking. Right. So. Because residential construction is down, the next place we look is the non-residential, right? And that's going to be your commercial building and things of that nature. And there are some surprising trends in that. In fact, when you look at the different breakdowns, right? Lodging up 22%. Public safety, 10.7. Fire stations, police stations, county jails, all of that stuff count. Amusement and recreation, right? In spite of the fact that we've got record inflation, people still want to go out and experience life, right?
Yeah, even the small suburbia town I live in, they're breaking ground on a water park and an outdoor adventure park this year that the city is, sponsoring on that. So.
And all of that building requires water and sewer, right? So you got to get the infrastructure out there, right?
Yeah, you think just the pipes, the concrete, all those things that it takes to build those sorts of things it's all part of it. It's all got to come by truck, right?
Yes, it does. Until we're in the days of Star Wars or Star Trek, there'll be no beaming of anything, right? It's delivery by truck. Yep. One of the areas, highway and street. Most people think the federal government builds the majority of the highways and streets, but in reality, it's actually local and state governments that account for that, using federal funds given to them. Yes, inflation is high, but much of your non-residential doesn't depend on interest rates. That's cash in hand.
Right.
And so commercial development generally uses capital, whether that's raised in the stock market or it's private capital. That's money they have in their control. Interest rates aren't a thing. And so that's still very strong and very positive.
Yeah, and seeing that manufacturing, the construction to build for manufacturing, that kind of leads into another thing that really influences Class 8 trucking activity, and that's actually those manufacturing goods, right? The things we make here in America, or close.
And one of the reasons I've been hesitant to call this a recession is because of the employment numbers. Look, it takes people to build things, right? Yes, there is more automation than there has ever been in a factory. However, it still takes people to build things. And when you look at the hiring numbers, it's not that bad. I mean, you're looking in the most recent labor report, which was just this December, we saw 28,000 jobs added in construction. That's pretty good, considering it's December, right? That's Christmas. 2 weeks of December, most people completely take that off, and so that's a strong number. Manufacturing had been adding about 13,000 jobs a month, Barry. In December, they added 8,000. I fully expected that number to be closer to zero or maybe even negative because it's December.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a difficult month to move things and it's a difficult month to build things, and yet they managed to make a positive dent in the number of people who are employed in manufacturing. And you can go down the list. There's an entire list that's put out by the government. If you're interested in seeing it, it's called the Table B1, Employees on Non-Farm Payrolls by Industry Sector and by Selected Industry Detail. And that is updated every month, generally about the 6th or 7th of the month. So I pay a lot of attention to this because for a recession, yes, you have negative GDP, but you also tend to have a contraction in jobs.
Sure.
And we're not seeing a contraction in jobs. We're actually, in the month change from November to December, there were 223,000 jobs added. Doesn't feel like a recession to me.
No, not at all. Now, one thing that can make it feel a little bit more like a recession, and what we are seeing some of, but it's still something that drives Class 8 trucking activity. That's consumption trends. And as inventories have gotten built back up, what are you seeing there, Chris? Are people consuming less or different? Are they changing what they're doing? Or
yeah, consumption is not positive.
Yeah.
It's just not because of the inventory in the system, Barry, and because people are buying less. Consumption numbers are just not up. Yeah. But your construction and industrial are holding on, and I come back to industrial because When you look at rail car activity, that typically is a 3-month indicator. So what the railroads are doing is 3 months ahead of what trucking companies are doing. And depending on what types of rail car activity you see, you can project which industries are booming. And as you might expect, lumber, not a lot of demand for lumber because that goes directly to residential. There is some commercial lumber, but a lot of your commercial use steel instead of lumber. But rail car activity, as reported by Stifel, it's up, and it's been up all year, Barry, which means we're seeing more carloads month over month coming onto the line and being delivered than there were at the same time last year when things were going great guns. And there's one trend in particular, Barry, that I call attention to, and there's a hot debate going on about whether the absence of container volume on the West Coast is a reflection of our economy cooling off, which many people are equating the lack of imports on the West Coast to a general poor economy, or is it a difference because of where that product's coming from? And I'm in the camp that the lack of West Coast demand is a function of supply chains being reshored, nearshored, or friendly shored. And let's take nearshore. That's Mexico, right? Sure. And when I look at the Kansas City Southern northbound traffic out of Mexico, in week 51, which was Christmas, Mexico traffic on that line was up 26%. And they report this number on a weekly basis. That is incredible. And what that means, Barry, is there's a lot of tier 1 commodities required to make the things you and I buy and the things our customers move. And it's coming north into the United States. It probably came from China. It was probably made in China 3 years ago, prior to the pandemic. But in order to survive, and we know this with automotive, we see it directly in our impact data, right?
Right.
So that increase, those Kansas City numbers in the terms of rail car activity, and automotive plays key in that.
Yeah.
There are a lot of parts come out of Mexico for our cars.
Yep. Yeah, and I think, reading that import data and, again, how is that important? And we can talk about this in another episode about spotting opportunities, and we will. But if I'm a trucking company in mid America, these things affect me too, right?
Absolutely. If you're a trucking company on the West Coast, you are absolutely being affected by the absence of import activity, right?
Right.
And how does this affect you? Well, if automotive is booming out of Mexico, maybe there's an adjacent market close to you, say Laredo.
Yeah.
It's not all that far. Maybe you should start looking at what it would take to have a presence in Laredo, because there's a lot of business in Laredo. Yeah. And the rates are strong, Barry. The last time I checked those rates, and as you mentioned, we'll get into this a little deeper, the contract rates were still a deal.
Yeah.
And right now, the spot market has been leading the rates down, but in Laredo, with respect to dry van going northbound, especially up into the Midwest where the seat of automotive manufacturing exists, those rates are very strong.
Yeah, and we were watching these ports for a while now through the pandemic, and we saw the shift. It can't change quick, right? It takes time to reroute those ships and those things, but will it go back? What do you?
That's a good question, and there is a great chart published by the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, and surprisingly, it's a month in arrears. Generally, when it comes to data, the government's data is a lagging indicator, right? And so we really can't use it to project, but it is a great descriptive or diagnostic of what's going on. And there's one chart in particular, and I've got the link in my panel there that you can go to, and that chart is interactive, and you can see on that chart that if you look at that red bubble, that is going to be the Port of Los Angeles. And that gray band there, Barry, is something you and I use quite a bit in our rate analytics. That band is the interquartile range, right? The 25th to the 75th percentile. And the median is called out. And you can see in recent months that port has been operating, once it cleared the backlog, that port is operating below its 25th percentile. That is a substantial trend. That is real. Now the question is, does that traffic come back once the longshoremen finally settle? And with the numbers I'm seeing out of Mexico, I don't know that traffic's coming back. I think some of it comes back, but not all of it. And what leads me to say that? Well, if you look at Long Beach, if you look at Long Beach, they just started, and they're whisper close to that 25th percentile. Mm-hmm. So it's even affecting the Long Beach port. But if you go over to Savannah,
they're the other way.
They're blowing the doors off. Yeah. They're well above their 75th percentile. In fact, they had a quarter, I think it was, where they were just below the median, but they've been blowing and going. And so, and you could see it in the trend line there. Every one of those columns are north. The other thing is there were news headlines, Barry, and so the ports in New York, New Jersey, there's a port that's landlocked and has been for about 50, 60 years, 100 years. I mean, there's no more congested city in the world than New York City, say maybe Mexico City or Tokyo, someplace like that. You're not going to build a bigger port. And so for that port to exceed its 75th percentile, dude, that's all productivity.
Yeah. And when the activity and business increases at those ports, it's a trickle around for the other businesses that were there. Now they're the supply and demand, right? The trucks are all going to the port instead of going to the steel mill that was there, the agriculture places. So that rising tide, right, is lifting all those.
Absolutely. And so when you just take a dance through, here's the Port of Charleston. The Port of Charleston, here's a port that's not landlocked. This port can grow even bigger than it is. Yep. They have plenty of land left to develop. And so if New York City is above its 75th percentile, New York, New Jersey, if the Port of Charleston is rocking and rolling, if the Port of Savannah is rocking and rolling, if the Port of Houston, and they all are, they're not as large as LA Long Beach, but they're all operating above their median or higher, or above their median and sometimes higher than their 75th percentile. That is a signal of friendly shoring. Yeah. That generally is a product that's being imported into the U.S. from South America and Europe. And so we see numbers that suggest the volume is growing out of Mexico. Mm-hmm. We see these port volumes. If this is product that was sourced in China, now sourced in Europe, mm-hmm. if this is product that was sourced in Asia Pacific, now sourced out of South America, those volumes are not going to return to the West Coast. Right. They're already landing in the most efficient place in the U.S. for them to land.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's just it's a shift, and it didn't happen overnight.
No, and it won't change overnight.
Kind of saw it coming, but just and then from what you said, maybe here to stay at least. Yeah. At least it is for some point.
Yeah. So I mean. It's easy to say that the East Coast and the Gulf Coast ports continue to experience above normal demand. The question is whether a labor agreement reached on the West Coast will return demand to the West Coast. Under normal circumstances, a non-militant China, I would expect all of it to return. But That's not the case. China is starting to exercise its elbows in the Asia Pacific region, and I think a lot of American manufacturers are looking for plan B. Yeah. They're not rolling up the carpet in China, but maybe they're not depending on China as their primary source for components to be assembled here in the U.S. Maybe they're looking to their other plants around the world. And in a prior life, I would be making these decisions when I worked for Emerson Electric. Yeah. That's exactly what I did. Buy or build, and if it's buy, where are we going to source it from? And it was really an easy equation, even though it was millions of dollars that flowed through that equation. You compared transportation cost to labor cost. Yeah. And if you could buy a product and land it cheaper than you could build that product into the U.S., because of survival, that's what you did.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's not just the cost, right, of being able to, it's the availability, the reliability, all those things you just mentioned. When JIT goes from just in time to just isn't there on there, that's when you got to make some changes and some decisions on there. And it may not be, cost may not be the only factor anymore, may not even be the main factor.
No, it's productivity at that point, because you're paying a whole room full of people who don't have the parts to build the product it is you need to sell to pay that room full of people. And so, JIT becomes secondary to having it. And as a result, and it was at Emerson, where I lived the dream of not having parts, where I discovered core capital spending. And a room full of people much smarter than me realized that there was a direct correlation between Emerson's ability to pay its dividend and core capital spending. Yeah. And so for the last 20 years, I've been watching core capital spending, and I will tell you, when core capital spending is positive, that is a good thing for manufacturing. And when manufacturing has money being injected into the things that it makes, which is core capital spending, then demand for trucking is going to be high, because at least in those channels, because that's a derived demand. There's no sense in making something you can't get to market.
Yeah. Criss, when we were working on this and, going over some of this information, I think the thing that popped out to me the most is there's data out there, and you can see it, and you don't have to be an economist or some kind of expert to see some of these general trends. And then the trick is, what's that matter to me as a trucking company owner or executive or a brokerage? How does that going to affect me? And you can start to see in these just how it affects the basic supply and demand, right? These ports are, you're having to pay a whole lot more for a truck. These ports are under market, those sorts of things. But that's kind of what jumped out to me. But what are some of the things was there anything that surprised you when you're going through this, or anything that was maybe affirmed that we thought or we talked about, but that backed me up?
For a while now, Barry, and we will get into this in another presentation, I've realized that headlines are tangential to reality. Mm-hmm. That headlines don't always properly note where we are, realistically speaking. And so if you read the news, and that's your only source, if you don't go and look at the data the way we've demonstrated today, you're making decisions based off of incomplete data. And that's dangerous, right? And so I guess what surprised me was it's not as bad as the headlines say it is, Barry. Is it rough right now? Yes, but it's always rough in December for trucking. Right? It's rough to find drivers, although this year probably not as rough as it was in years past. Certainly last year it was very difficult to find capacity. December is going to be problematic for a multitude of reasons. I think that January is going to be a pleasant surprise in the trucking industry. And I'm not ready to I'm not ready to use that recession word. I'm still not ready to use that recession word. Yes, we've had 2 negative quarters of gross domestic product. That's a contraction. Labor is just too strong
Yeah.
for this to be a real recession.
Yeah, and I think one thing we've heard from other folks too that definitely can't take credit for, but I think we agree that it may be the rest of the world that trucking does a little better.
Yeah.
Than maybe not recession proof if it happens, or slowdown proof, but if trucking may sneeze while the rest of the world catches a cold,
Right.
on
Right.
that sort of thing.
At least in the U.S. for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank everyone for spending some time with us today. Hope you learned something, and we look forward to doing it all again.
Thank you for your business.